Good evening and welcome everyone. First of all, I kindly request our audience to mute their microphones during our panelist interventions, please. On the other hand, I would like to say that each panelist will have 15 minutes to present, and if at the end of the presentation we have time left, we can open a quick Q&A session. If you have questions, please write them through the chat. First, on behalf of Dr. Pedro Salazar Ugarte, Director of the Legal Research Institute of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, who apologized as he had to attend an emergency, you are all welcome to our event. Personally, I appreciate Dr. Salazar's hospitality and generosity to support this academic event. I am delighted to be surrounded by all of you. I am thrilled. Thank you so much for attending this event. Thank you for being here, this event talking about the culture of peace. Thank you so much to our panelists for accepting this online invitation. The original event was scheduled to be held in person in March 6th, but it had to be postponed due to COVID-19. You know, things happen for a reason though. Throughout the pandemic, and in particular during the last few convulsed days, I thought that now more than ever, we should hold our events and talk about different topics, ranging from mediation, everyday work as practitioner or teacher, to civil rights. These are tough moments for the world in general, but at the same time, we can see an opportunity to bring about positive transformations to society through the culture of peace. It is everyone's responsibility to engage in the culture of peace. It invites us to participate, to be proactive and pro-social. Education is the foundation to promote a peace culture. Without further ado, let's start with our first panelist, Judge Daniel Weinstein, who will be presenting Mediating After COVID and George Floyd, What's Different and What's the Same. Judge Daniel Weinstein is one of the preeminent mediators of complex civil disputes in the United States. Judge Daniel Weinstein is also internationally recognized as one of the premier mediators
you're running back and forth
of complex, multi-party, and high-stakes commercial and political disputes. He is the recipient of the 2014 International Advocate for Peace Award from the Cardozo Journal of Conflict Resolution, whose past honorees have included former Presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Bishop Desmond Tutu. The National Law Journal has recognized him as an ADR champion 2017-2018. He received the Peacemaker Award from the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at Pepperdine University on January 23rd. I can help mentioning I had the privilege to be there. He is a founder of JAMS, the world's largest private mediation provider, and the Weinstein International Foundation, a non-profit initiative dedicated to making mediation available and accessible worldwide in the face of increasing global challenges and conflict. Fernando Navarro and myself are proud senior Weinstein International Fellows. Judge Danny, please proceed.
Bienvenido, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really just was thinking a few minutes ago, we had planned this trip through Nuria had organized this seminar for the culture of peace, and we were all going to go to Mexico City, and Fernando was going to be our host, and Jan and Jonathan were going to come, and at that time I didn't know Clarence would be part, but maybe we could have dragged him down there, and with Nuria, and we were going to make a whole Mexican and trip out of it. And this is the next best thing. So when Nuria, through her leadership, and all of us decided, let's go ahead, let's try to do it virtually. It won't be quite as great as if we were all together, and we could celebrate after with the appropriate libations. But nevertheless, we're awfully glad to be here. And for me, as Nuria said, this is a tough time for all of us. Let's just, we're all, no matter your age, your station in life is, how well or poorly you're set economically, this is a tough time. And we're all kind of raw, and to some degree, this has shaken up a lot of things in our lives. And so I was really happy to be surrounded by people who share the same image of the world and who are dedicating a lot of their careers toward peace and toward conflict resolution. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I was originally, by the way, going to be following Clarence Jones, who you will hear from later, someone I've admired from far, but I thought following him was going to be sort of like the bar singer who follows Andre Bocelli, and it's not a good spot to be in. So right. Nuria switched me to leadoff hitter. So I am now the leadoff hitter, who will be followed by a great lineup of Jan and Fernando, Jonathan, and then we'll hear from Clarence Jones. So we've got a wonderful lineup, and I'm delighted to be your leadoff hitter. So I'm gonna speak on the impact that the coronavirus pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement has had on mediation and might have on mediation in the future. But I'm going to do that through the lens of the fellows, the Weinstein Jams fellows, and to give you some idea of how I think it's going to affect, both good and bad, their efforts at bringing about and enhancing the culture of peace through mediation. A little bit of history first, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. About 14 years ago, I partnered with the Jams Foundation. Jan Martinez, who's here, was one of the early pioneers of that, to start a program to bring over 10 fellows from around the world to spend a year in the United States studying mediation, shadowing some of the most experienced mediators in the United States, and then go back to their country and practice mediation in some form. We had no idea when we started and offered a scholarship and this opportunity that we would have these remarkable people from all corners of the earth. And they came and they applied. And they came from Albania, they came from Georgia, they came from Romania, they came from all corners of the earth, South America, North America. They came from everywhere. And we had to go through 200, 300 applications and find 10 people who we thought might have that hidden magic. They all had this desire to spend their career in conflict resolution of some kind. But what we weren't aware of was that there were all these people with the magic in little villages, in police departments, in hospitals, in law schools. Some were 23, 24 years old, and some were Supreme Court judges, former Supreme Court judges in Ethiopia, South Africa, and other countries of the world. So they came and they studied, and they learned, and they shared their experiences, their cultural experiences, and their experiences with mediation with us. And then they went back to their countries. Many of you know the idea was that they would spend up to a year in the United States and then go back and then practice mediation in some form. Some went back to change their judicial system. Some went back and started a little practice in Kabul or in some little city near Karachi, or to practice with other people in trying to start a practice that fit the particular culture of their community. We had people like Sharif who tried to organize all of the Arab countries and open up mediation offices in the Arab countries. We had all sorts of different efforts to take this new phenomena, new, I say, in terms of its popularity, it's been around a long time, of mediation, and to try to bring it back to their country in some form. So, as you know, we had many emerging superstars. Some people went back and struggled and had a hard time. Some were their careers just exploded meteorically. And so these fellows, however, became senior fellows, and the wave of mediation that we've seen had begun. And it was remarkable as we traveled the world to find that in most of the countries, the young lawyers, the young judges, the new generation were all hip to mediation, to ADR. It was part of their legal culture, whereas we had many resistances so these young practitioners of mediation, with the wave of ADR and dispute resolution being experimented in places throughout the world. And by the way, I knew mediation was happening when the minister, short in height but not in her stature, the Minister of Justice of Georgia, country of Georgia, stood up to a crowd of about 400 people in the Ministry of Justice and said, "Folks, in Georgia, ADR is litigation. Litigation is the alternative. In Georgia, the first stop is mediation." And the crowd, for me, it was great because I thought most of my career, 32 years, thinking I was doing ADR. Now I was the first choice for the first time. But it was a symbol to me that the world was changing and that people were beginning to integrate into their cultures a new modality, a new way of dealing with problems that did not exist before in any form. And that your generation, I see most of you come from the younger generation, we're going to be the recipients of the pioneering work that these people have done. But the senior fellows, and there are 140 of them now in 70-something countries. They weren't satisfied with practicing in their office in Helsinki or Karachi or Kabul or in Tel Aviv or wherever they were, in Quito and other places, they began to reach out and expand their community. And they began to form alliances to see whether or not this modality of mediation and conflict resolution could be applied to community problems, to regional problems, to some international problems, and whether when they combine together, they could bring force to these problems that traditional diplomacy, politics, economic leverage, warfare, and others had failed at. You say that's a big chunk these pioneers were chewing off, and it's true. What kinds of things did these young people, with the help and direction of the board of the foundation, what kind of problems did they take on? Migration, pollution, climate change, stolen art, all sorts of problems, from little to small, to a group headed by Fernando who went to a little village in Mexico and tried to help mediate their problems, which had been festering for about 400 years. And so these pioneers began to explore whether symbiotically, whether combined together, and whether taking this new modality to the problems that plague our planet, plague regions, plague states, areas. In Africa, they're doing all sorts of imaginative stuff. They began to look to the limits that our mediation and our culture of peace, because that's what it's about, could be adopted to many of the problems that we all live with. And what are the return? We've had some successes. We've, of course, had our frustrating failures. We're learning as we go along, and they're learning as they go along. But one thing is true. They've done something remarkable. They've expanded the community. They've expanded the idea of what are the interests at stake in a dispute. And they've brought to the dispute, a mixture of talent that optimizes the chances of finding a compromise solution, and in creating that safe space, the safe space for resolution that all of us look to find, no matter how we practice our form of ADR, conflict resolution. So hats off to these group of pioneers, and many of them from organizations like ours who are joining them in the effort to say, hey, you know what? Traditional diplomacy, politics, warfare, economic leverage, nationalism, all this stuff, it ain't worked so well. We want to change the planet. And this, so what I'd like to, in the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to talk to you about how the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter has changed the landscape and for our fellows, for all people practicing mediation, whether you're a mediator or whether you're a lawyer who's representing a client, after starting now, okay? Some things are better and some things are going to be tougher. So let's quickly just talk about them, and then I know that some of our speakers who are going to follow me are going to talk about it more specifically. But I tried to to just highlight the things that I thought that were the most important. The first is that what did we learn from the pandemic? We learned we're all in this together. Walls don't keep viruses out. There are problems, and we knew that from climate change. We know that from migration. We know that now much more poignantly from the virus, that we're in this together, folks. And we need to find ways in which we can coordinate our efforts, obviously, to solve those problems. And I think the virus has made people expand their idea of what is community. What are our common interests? And an understanding that economic barriers, physical barriers, and all sorts of other defenses don't protect us from those forces. And so therefore, we've got to find ways of dealing with them. And what better modality than mediation? And we're going to do a lot of the cleanup, folks. A lot of you on the who are there. We're going to be doing a lot of the cleanup after this pandemic, and because the courts are going to take a long time to recover, economies are going to take a long time to recover, and we can move quickly and provide safe spaces in which to deal with some of these problems. So it's both a time of tumult and confusion and anxiety and stress, but it's a time of opportunity. You know, I said the other day, the Chinese have a symbol, that the symbol in Chinese for crisis is the same as the symbol for opportunity. They knew something back then. So we have an opportunity now, and we, the pioneers in the culture of peace, and some of us using mediation as our tools, others of you will use other modalities. It's our time to try to go out there and help resolve some of these problems and create the safe space for people to do it. So that the pandemic has created that. It's also created a whole new technology. Here we are having a meeting with all of us. I was on the phone. I was on Zoom or some new one, Virtual or whatever it was last night, with Adolphe from the Congo, having a conversation about problems in the Congo, like he was next door. We have meetings, and it has made distance not a barrier to attempting to solve problems and to have some kind of contact between human beings. Now, are there limitations to it? Are we finding some of those of us who are trying to mediate in this new world? Certainly there are. There were some advantages to being close, to be able to touch, to smell, to see, to look. I do a look me in the eye test all the time. Look me in the eye and tell me you really aren't going to pay more than $10,000. Look me in the eye, Sam. Well, not today. Okay, you should have said. So I can't do my look you in the eye test at a distance. But we can do amazing things, folks. We can do things that I never imagined really existed before this happened. I had a meeting with a school board and the Board of Education, and they all attended. We can go into a regional problem and have people not have to travel a long way for it, but to go and practice wherever they live. Imagine how many people that will include. How in a domestic case you don't just have the husband and wife there maybe and who couldn't come, but you can have a whole family attend if it's important to do so. Neighbors in community disputes, all sorts. And I expect that the lawyers who are practicing mediation, the good mediation advocates who understand that it's a different art form than litigation, and who are learning to use that art form to their advantage and that of their clients, are going to be creating and inventing processes that we never dreamed of to resolve disputes. And those of us, and there's some here who've spent their careers mediating and so on, as I've get longer in the tooth on it and experience, I have more and more respect for process, the planning, the comfort of people, where does it take place, the timing of it, who's present, all those things that get planned, and they pay off big time in terms of the success of resolving things. And this tool, this technology, which people are now comfortable with, familiar with, will not only save a lot of aggravation and art, but it will allow us to do things we never dreamed of. So let your creative minds go to work on all the ways that you think we can use this successfully. And then keep in mind, when you're doing that there are some limitations to it. We're finding that out as we go along. A friend of mine mediating the other day said he was doing fine until one of the lawyers, young kid, and his buddy ran back and forth in the room nude, and had everybody in hysterics as they were throwing water balloons at each other. So we have some things we have to work out with this, but dogs barking and kids running through it, but we'll learn, and it's an exciting venture. Let me just tell you a couple more that are critical, and that is, we never expected that the Black Lives Matter movement and the tragic killing of George Floyd took place, as all of us know, at the end of the not at the end of, after 3 months of the pandemic, when everybody was raw and anxious, and then a series of just tragic, inexcusable incidents took place, which reminded us and reminded America of its injustices and of how far we had to go. The resulting demonstrations and what took place after is one of the most remarkable things in the 79 years of my life. And Clarence Jones, who's going to talk later, of course, was an advisor to the great Martin Luther King, and always admired him for that. I was at the March on Washington and stood there and heard his magnificent words, and I thought that was going to be the sort of highlight moment of in I think what has occurred over the last month, and the inclusion in the protests of people from all races and all economic levels, and now from other countries, and the joining in from other countries, gives us some hope. Do we have the lesson that people all feel good and so on, and then when it's over, they go back to who they are? We've got to guard against that. We've got to hope that will not happen. But this was a remarkable movement. And what does that mean for us mediators? Okay. It means, to me, two things. People got in touch with some kind of empathy. They lived George Floyd's death. They stood outside with flashlights trying to pay respect to his tragic life and death. They began to try to put themselves in the place of people who've been discriminated against in a society that has been tilted for a very long time. And a lot of us don't use our empathy muscles as much as we should. And those of us who are mediators and you who are mediation practitioners know that it can be your biggest tool. And so what is the aftermath? It left two things. It left people, I think, with raw nerves and wounds that will be easily picked at in mediations, in attempts to in attempts to bring about resolutions to conflict. And so all of us are going to have to hone. I had a lot of trouble getting when I would sometimes preach to people, put yourself in and I said, people would look at me like I was crazy. It's a form of thinking and reacting that takes a lot of personal growth and inventory, and an antenna that is not developed overnight. But when I taught mediation, I've always started by saying to young practitioners and to people who want to become mediators, the better person you are, the more conscious you are, the more developed you are, the more you understand your own bias and your own faults, the more you understand how you come off to women, how you come off to old people, how you come off to people of certain cultures, the more you understand about that and can counteract it or get advice how you can get through or why you're offending them, the better and the more conscious you are of the unspoken going on in the room, the better you will be at our practice. And I've seen when it's occurred, and I'm sure you have, absolutely remarkable things happen in the mediation room. Let me just give you one example, and then I'm going to end, and I hope I haven't taken too much time. Because I was trying to think today when I was talking about empathy and the fact that all of us have to go back to school. That's something that, for instance, our board of our foundation, we're all going, before we go out and teach and conduct seminars on racial bias and cultural bias, and bring that around the world of the 75 countries where we have fellows, we better check ourselves out. And we need help and direction. So we're and I think it's true of everybody in our profession. It's time to do inventory. It's time to grow a new skin. It's not too late. And we all carry around things we just don't know. And the magic of it, and by the way, judges are the worst. Judges never get feedback when they're on the bench. Their power comes right from the Almighty, and they think that they never find out how they affect people, whether they're good listeners, whether they treat men or women in the same way, whether they're condescending to African Americans. They never get feedback on that. And so we, as mediators in the world that we operate in, conflict resolvers, we better do our own inventory first. And then with those tools honed and in better shape, we can go take it to some of the problems that exist and the magic that can occur. And those of you who've done mediation have seen it occur when the out of the arena and the conflict and the bargaining and the bitterness. So suddenly the magic of reconciliation takes over. When suddenly people feel heard and when they feel like people understand their pain and their suffering or their cause, and it's authentic, it can't be false. You can't just say to people, oh, I feel sorry, I can feel your pain. It's like apology. If it's not sincere, it doesn't work. But when it's sincere, I'll close with by just telling you the power of I had, it's about 10 years ago, one of the rollover cases of cars which were built without proper suspension. And one of them, I won't name the automaker that did it, one of them rolled over with 5 young people in the thing, and they were all killed. And we had a mediation with the lawyers insisted that an executive come out from Detroit for the company, and he came. And the parents were there, and of course, suffering and whatever. And the executive vice president of this company, we started talking about the defenses, and the lawyers got up, and he just said, "Stop it, stop it, stop it." He said, "Could the lawyers leave?" And he asked the parents to stay. And he said he had a kid the same age. And he asked if he could say a prayer and we could end the mediation. And whether he could pray for them, and he did. And therefore, he said, I don't want to do this mediation. I want to know who you are. I want to know the pain you suffered. And here's my promise. I'm going to go back to Michigan. Give me 1 week. I'm going to talk to our company. I'm going to talk to our board. I'm going to talk to them about what you've suffered and lost and about what our mistake is. And I'm going to come back here with a plan to make the best reparations that we know how. I don't want to talk about motors and suspension and all that. That's an indignity to you. And they all sat together and they prayed. And he went back to Michigan and he came back and they settled the case the following week and so on. But it was so powerful that he took this away. And I've seen things like that happen with cultures, with people who've been ignored all the time, by people just being heard and feeling safe. That's our job, folks. As in the culture of peace, in the world of conflict resolution where we all operate, that's our task, to do it with both the benefits we've gotten from these 2 world-shaking events that have occurred in our time, and to maximize the advantages, and then we'll try to overcome the disadvantages. And that'll take some time and some work and struggle. But as you know, I think it's an exciting time for us to take our form and our skills and apply them to the human struggles that are out there, and to expand the community as we have defined it before. So thank you all. I know I sound a little bit like a proselytizer about it, but I believe that you all are the future, and the culture of peace is our only chance.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from the others who are here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judge Danny, for a wonderful participation. I believe that this crisis is equal to opportunity, indeed. And empathy is
Nuria?
I was saying, Danny, that empathy is a mediator's greatest tool. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Professor Janet Martinez, who will present dispute system design in a divided community. Janet Martinez is Senior Lecturer in Law and Director of the Martin Daniel Gould Center for Conflict Resolution at Stanford Law School. As you know, one of the most prestigious universities worldwide. Janet Martinez focuses her research and consulting on the lawyer's role in negotiation domestically and internationally, facilitation and public disputes, particularly in the fields of international trade and the environment, negotiation and consensus building training, negotiation curriculum development for clients in the public, private, and non-profit sectors, and conflict resolution system design. Precisely regarding this last topic, resolution system design, Stanford University Press just released her book with Lisa Ansler and Stephanie Smith, Dispute System Designs, Preventing, Managing, and Resolving Conflict. Welcome, Jan. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to my friend Nuria and to my colleague, Dr. Gonzalez-Martin. And thank you all for welcoming us to a virtual experience in Mexico City. My husband was Mexican-American, and I relish my opportunities to be with you. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to take a little more scholarly, let us say, but practical view of thinking about dispute systems. Thank you very much, Mariana. So I will, my topic of my book, as Nuria kindly referenced, is dispute system design. What is that? Next slide. What is it? How do you think about it, whether you're a lawyer, a judge, academic, or a regular person? And what's an example? And the example I'm going to draw upon is that of a divided community that we're conscious of in these times. So dispute system design is not complicated. It is, next, it is one or more processes that are adopted to prevent, manage, or resolve a stream of disputes that are connected with a particular organization or institution. Next. So examples, just to give you a practical lens, it could be in the nature of public and community justice. Courts are a public justice system that all of us as countries have designed to fit our cultures. Claims facilities, if we have a natural disaster or we have a terrorist attack or a products liability conflict, any one of these could look for a system that is going to determine who's responsible and how do we compensate those who have been harmed. So claims facilities are very often a fairly complicated and very expensive process. Communities. I don't know if you have neighborhood social media in Mexico, but you can have it at the neighborhood level. You can have restorative justice within a community in cooperation with the criminal court. But these are all examples of public systems. More everyday systems would include companies. So for an example, any disputes with their business partners, commercial relationships, or employees. Those would all be systems, often involve arbitration, either private commercial arbitration. They may go to Judge Danny's court, or they may be mediated or used in ombuds in a university context. Lastly, a third category is to look at international conflict and whether it's a treaty, whether it's an investor-state arbitration, whether it's a cross-boundary eBay dispute between a seller in Argentina and a buyer in Minnesota. So these are transitional justice, would be in a post-conflict situation where countries are trying to resolve the injustice, possibly the death, and the nature of peace and procedural justice. All those things are trying to be synthesized through some kind of a system or process. So these are example of contexts where a system might arise. Next. So a lens for thinking about systems, if you have the opportunity to design or redesign one in your area of work, my colleagues and I came up with a framework of 6 elements that we felt would be most salient and worth thinking about if you're in a position to be a designer. Goals is first, stakeholders, context and culture, processes, resources, and evaluation for success. So in terms of goals, I would say this is probably the most important of the factors, is what are you trying to accomplish? What is the systems trying to achieve? Is it justice? Is it peace? Is it fair process? Is it voice? As Danny said, do people just need to be heard? Is it compliance with the law? There are a lot of very good goals, but generally speaking, you can't do them all. So whether it's efficiency or voice, those are different goals, and someone will be making a decision about what those goals are and how they apply it. So in civil courts in California in the last few years, we've had tremendous cutbacks in our budgets. And that has meant is up to a third of the courts have been closed. So what does the process look like in the courts? And what is most important? Is it that people get to court? Maybe an online process, as we're using now during COVID, is a better option because it gets more people heard and processed. Or it could be that you're trying to create a process that has more satisfaction for the parties. They feel like there's an opportunity, procedural justice, as well as outcomes that are fair and just. So goals would be really important to determine what's most important. Stakeholders, who cares? Who are the parties and who's affected by this particular dispute? And what are their interests? Context and culture really looks at what are the norms for communication and conflict management for a given country. So all the JAMS fellows over the last 14 years have come from all over the world. They have learned some norms for approaching mediation, but they've also tailored those processes to their own cultures and context for the most effectiveness. Next. The processes and culture. This is really where the designer can be creative, thinking about what kind of process do you want to use? Do you want one or multiple processes? Are you focused on preventing more disputes for medical malpractice, for example, having better relationships and better communication between the doctor providers and the patients? Managing disputes for a business, disputes come up with employees or vendors. How can we manage them so they don't end up filing for court resolution? So thinking about process options. Processes can range. For an example, let's imagine that Clarence and I, we are musicians. We start a music store. And after a few years, we run into some kind of a dispute, and we're not sure that we can be partners anymore. So I hope Clarence and I would have a conversation and we would think about what are our interests, what made us want to go into business together, and how can we resolve this. But if we have troubles and we can't do the job ourselves, we might go to a third party. So we can go to Fernando or Jonathan as a mediator, someone who can help us more effectively resolve our disputes. Or we'll go to Judge Weinstein at the end of the day, and he will make a decision. So as we move through those process options, we're shifting from the parties having control over the process and the outcome to shifting that power to either a judge or an arbitrator who will make a decision and will run the process. Or in between, we can probe the effectiveness of mediation. So thinking about what kind of processes you want. In many situations, it is not easy to access the institutions that provide these processes. So increasingly, online dispute resolution is becoming an option as well. Resources. Let's imagine that we have designed the most wonderful system, but we don't have much of a budget. And so if we have a bicycle budget, how do we actually apply the resources that pays for the process, and what kind of training and support in the human resource category is available to us? So resources. And lastly, just thinking about process success and accountability. Is this a transparent system? Do people understand what their choices are and what that means and the consequences? And are we measuring whether we have achieved the goals that were first identified? So next, a critical question around system design is who has the power and who has the control and who designs the system. Is it one party or is it all the parties that are potentially affected? Is it a third party? Is it the employer? Is it a one party? Is there's something that is done at Stanford called regulatory sandbox, which is really design thinking and trying to come up with ways that are responsive to all the parties that might be affected. And then who gets to choose which of those processes make sense? So let me move to my example because I know that we're a little crunched on time. Next, please. So a colleague of Jonathan's and mine, Mr. Grand Lum, has been working with the Ohio State Moritz School of Law, and they have really developed a whole program for thinking about divided communities. Grand Lum was with the U.S. Department of Justice for a number of years, and he was director of their the Community Relations Service. And they were called upon for the kinds of incidents that we have seen in the last few months and actually 100 years, where we've had injustice and racial justice has been absent, and there's really been increasing levels of violence. So the Divided Community program has really tried to get ahead of the ball. They need to move faster, but they need to anticipate and prevent these kinds of incidents from breaking out in communities. So they have really focused on thinking about what are the goals and how can interveners such as community mediators and conciliators, how can they increase the resilience of a community to deal with these stresses, these mistakes, and these violent outbreaks? How can they help the relationships get built? And how can they build trust where there has been none? And no reason to. There's really no credibility within the institutions. And the kinds of steps that the divided community has really fostered is to identify who is affected, who's touched, who's harmed, who are the stakeholders and parties, and how can we approach them and give them voice? How can we assess the situation? How can we identify and address the causes of terrible community division, whether it's housing, no jobs, health, education? These are all issues in all of our communities. And how can we identify what is working and what is not, and really create opportunities for collaboration among the law enforcement parties, the local officials, the mayors, the city councils, the schools and the teachers, the religious institutions, the institutions of faith, and how they are connected with the community and can really serve as the glue and the opportunity to connect people and to move into a safe space of empathy, as Judge Weinstein outlined. So really thinking about the different pieces of the system. I heard Anna Deavere Smith speak at church a couple weeks ago, and she said, "You may all be looking at me to say something and advise you on what you should do to act in these times." She said, "I'm not going to tell you." She said, "You need to be creative as citizens in the community, the culture of peace, as Nuria has laid out for us. You need to think about where is the harm, where is the sorrow and the anger, and what are the things that you can do as a person. So whether it is dealing with your community, with your neighbors, your schools, how can you be part of that, that conversation of responsibility, so the culture of peace can be fostered." Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Jan. As always, was excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, indeed, system design can really help prevent civil unrest. Definitely. Our next panelist is Fernando Navarro, who will talk about its implication for interpersonal conflict. Fernando Navarro Sanchez is a commercial mediator with JANS and the representative for JANS in Latin America. He has experience mediating and co-mediating complex mediations involving parties and counsel from Latin America, the US, and Europe. He has significant experience in the energy sector, specifically in renewable energy in Mexico and Latin America. He has participated as a pro bono mediator in large community and labor matters in different parts of Mexico. Please, Fernando, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nuria, for the invitation. It is a tremendous honor for me to be among so important and fascinating people, and a great opportunity to be speaking from the Mexican perspective, in addition to what Nuria has been saying. And I'm going to talk about very simple things, really. These are very simple concepts, but that I've found particularly in the recent weeks and days that they explain a lot of what we as individuals can do. In the end, simple things, but with an explanation that make, I hope, and it is certainly my case, this explanation has made it very persuasive for me to understand these simple concepts that I will present to you. The first concept, and of course it relates to what Nuria said, polarization, this word that we hear more and more, and how it translates into the everyday conflict, whether that is with our neighbors, our family, our friends, in the workplace, or in commercial or civil interactions. The first concept that I'm going to talk about is conformity. Okay, this is a concept. There's a book that really inspired me to discuss this topic. A book by a behavioral economist called Cass Sunstein, and he published this book called Conformity. And he refers to two elements that generally define conformity. And one is that actions and statements of other people provide information about what is true and right? So when I don't know exactly what is true and what is right, I look for the statements and actions of other people. And the other element is that actions and statements of other people provide information about what I have to do if I want to remain in the good graces, or if I want to become part of that group, if I want to belong to a group. So this is a bias. Conformity is a bias, is a shortcut for our decision making and our thoughts. And what it does is, when we have little information, we follow what most of the people, or all the people that we trust, what they do. This is a good thing for the most part. This is a blessing of our human condition, because we are able to survive and go through the days with an efficient use of our resources. It makes our life easier, and it promotes the civilization, really, but it also causes tribalism, it causes divisionism, it causes all this polarization that we are seeing so clearly in many places in the world. What he says, Sunstein, the author, is that when a group deliberates about a particular topic, there's a deliberation about, let's say, bullfighting, right? Let's talk about bullfighting, and you go with your friends that don't like bullfighting. You don't like bullfighting. You don't necessarily have the objective ideas or criteria. Besides, of course, that you find it gruesome or whatever. But more than that, you're not interested in any other argument. But you are against bullfighting. Very legitimate. What happens is that when you go with a group of friends that are against bullfighting, you will end up more polarized, more towards the extreme against bullfighting, because you will confirm that you were right, that there are things that indeed make it a bad thing, right? But what happens though is that the same is going on in the other room, right? So the same is happening with those group of people that that enjoy bullfighting. So this polarization, really, this going to the extremes, is highlighted by the social networking, of course, and the algorithms that go with the functioning of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, that feed us with the information that we are interested in, and therefore we're there in a spiral of confirmation of what we think. So the author of this book, Conformity, tells us that we're at a point in history where polarization and tribalism and divisionism is at a very high level. Now, why does that matter to the individual, family, labor, neighbor, civil, commercial disputes? It matters because of one word, one big fascinating concept that is essential in conflict resolution, and that is trust. Okay? I'll refer now to trust a little bit, the second concept that I wanted to talk to you about, and then propose a little bit of what we can do and to improve really peace in our very individual, very bottom line group where we live, right? And I'm going to talk about trust, speaking first about game theory. For those of you that are interested in economy and mathematics and so on, you may remember this movie, A Brilliant Mind, I think, with Russell Crowe. Anyways, he invented that guy that Russell Crowe plays in the movie, invented the game theory. Well, what it does, very simply, it shows that in a strategic conflict, people decide based on the information they have available and on how much they trust the other person. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about a famous example of the game theory, and that is the prisoner's dilemma. But I'm going to try to explain it differently in a way that I heard it once and was very clear and easy for me to understand. Imagine that I give two people empty envelopes, okay? And then I also give them, each person, a 500 pesos bill. And they have to either put the money in the envelope or put the money in their pockets. Then whatever they do, they won't tell to each other what they did, and they will give the envelopes back to me. I see the envelope, I open it, and if I see a bill of 500 pesos, I will put another one. But if I don't see any bill, then I won't put anything there. So that means that if both of them put the money in the envelope, I will give them back. And then what I do is I switch the envelopes, I switch them and give them back to them, okay? So if they both put money, then they will get 1,000 pesos each. But if only one of them put the money, then that one person that put the money will end up with 0 pesos, and the other one will end up with 1,500, okay? And the other alternative is that they both put the money in their pockets and they get 500 each. So the best course of action, the best idea would be for them both to put the money in the envelope, one would think, and that will create the most value for everyone, right? But that very rarely happens. That very rarely happens for 2 reasons. One is that they don't know what the other person will do, right? They don't know what, so there is information asymmetry. They don't know what's going on in the other room or in the other hand. And that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if I trusted what he or she is going to do. Trust can allow us to believe that the other person will behave in a way that will benefit me as well, that we will collaborate for a better result. But in conflict, that very rarely happens. So what we do in mediation is try to equilibrate or generate a trust environment, much like Judge Weinstein explained earlier, provide a safe environment for people to try to understand and obtain information. When that doesn't happen, then the conflict naturally escalates. So the problem with polarization, the problem with conformity, and this gets me back there where we started. The problem is that as we identify more and more with one group, with a tribe, with a sector of the society, we identify less and we distrust more the other group or the different groups. And that leads to less trust in general, but of course, in less trust in our interactions and more disputes, and more easily disputes become, catch on the fire. Trust in a way keeps, the woods humid. Without trust, fire catches on very easily. So that is the problem with polarization and private conflict. The least we trust each other in our immediate environment, the more easily conflict arises and conflict escalates because of the lack of trust. So what we do now, and this is why I told you that I have a very simple thing to tell you, but in the end, I hope with this explanation can, stick with you, is that we should, and this is also a proposition by Cass Sunstein in the end, in his book Conformity, that we should welcome dissent. We should welcome people that think differently in a group of friends, really, in our group, in our family. And whether that is political visions, whether that is, sports, whether that is whatever, we should welcome that difference of views and difference of, and be ready to listen to it to the extent possible without prejudice, without judging. That simple activity, we don't need to agree. I'm not asking you to agree with people that are not like you. Just listen to them and welcome that, provide that safe space for people to think differently in your environments. And if we do that, then we can keep a society that is, diverse enough, but not polarized. If we do the opposite, though, if we keep rejecting people that think differently and, immediately disqualifying whatever criteria is opposed to mine, what we do is that we expel people from our groups. So say you have a cousin that is against the politician that you like, and everyone else in the family is with the politician. What will happen is that that cousin will leave. He will never come back to the family meetings. and then the group will become more easily go to the extreme. Okay, so that is really what we should, and it is very much at our reach. We can do that. We can all welcome dissenting opinions. We can all welcome different views of things, and that will give us a more trustful environment. So to help us build more trust and to solve conflicts and to manage conflicts more easily at a very basic level, we are interested, and we should be interested in welcoming those different views and being tolerant and respectful of that. So very simple concept, Nuria, but I think it helps to the conversation of building peace.
Thank you so much, Fernando. It was amazing to hear you. It was an excellent presentation. So peace can only prevail through more trust and less conformity, right? Thank you. Our next panelist is Jonathan Greenberg, who will participate with Why Direct Action? Jonathan D. Greenberg is Senior Associate Director and Scholar in Residence at the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. In 2018, Dr. Clarence B. Jones and Jonathan Greenberg co-founded the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice to disseminate the teachings and strategies of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi in response to the moral emergencies of the 21st century. For the previous 30 years, he taught as a lecturer in law at Stanford Law School, where he taught and advised international graduate students, JDs, and undergraduates, and he published widely in the field of international conflict resolution. Please, Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nuria. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here. Professor Nuria Gonzalez is one of my most admired and favorite people. So I'm thrilled to be invited, and I'm with a wonderful panel. So thank you all. I want to begin with a quick observation. There was an early sermon of Dr. Martin Luther King in which he called nationalism a false god that unfortunately too many people believe in, leading to terribly tragic results. And we see that in the world today far more than I wish we did. In my country, we have a president that says America first. And I start by saying I think that's wrong. Human beings are first, human rights are first, justice is first, love is first, not your nation. But I also have to say I have one exception, which is that I regret I couldn't come to Mexico to be with you because I really have a great fondness for the Bebida Nacional of Mexico. And I hope I can enjoy with each of you some of the authentic national drink of tequila next time I come. I've had some beautiful experiences sharing tequila with friends in Mexico, and I hope I can share them with you next time. So next, please. Thank you. I'm going to be speaking on the question, why direct action? That's a question that was posed by Dr. Martin Luther King in a very famous essay he wrote called Letter from a Birmingham Jail in April 1963. He asked the question and he answered the question. So I want to spend the first part of my talk talking about something that happened a long time ago in April 1963. And then I want to conclude by talking about the relevance of that discussion to our situation today in the United States and also in Mexico. Next, please. Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 was an extreme form of what Fernando was talking about when he discussed polarization and what Professor Martinez talked about when she discussed the concept of a divided community. Birmingham, Alabama was segregated. Not only was it segregated, but it was the most vicious city of segregation in Jim Crow segregation in the South. By Jim Crow segregation, I mean that, as you all know, Black people who lived in Birmingham couldn't go to a white restaurant, couldn't stay in a white hotel, students couldn't go to a white school, even though the Supreme Court of the United States had declared that they could. But there was massive resistance on the part of white segregationists to block the Supreme Court ruling. So it was a viciously segregated society, and it was enforced by violence. Next, please. So the violence was both the mobs of people, white people defending segregation, but enforced, next please, by violence very, very deliberately and viciously through the terrorism, next slide please, terrorism of the KKK and of the white militias, often in association with the police. The nickname of the town was Birmingham because there were countless bombings of Black people's homes throughout the city, including the most important civil rights leader, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was bombed many times. So when Judge Weinstein talks about a safe place for conflict resolution, that did not exist in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Next slide, please. So the topic that we have today, this is a effigy of hanging of Martin Luther King. White segregationists said to Martin Luther King, if you come into this town, this is what we're going to do to you, so you better stay out. Next slide, please. So we're discussing a culture of peace, how to create a culture of peace. So there cannot be a culture of peace in an environment like Birmingham, Alabama in early 1963 that's defined by brutal and persistent and systemic violence, violation of human rights. You can have a peaceful, quote unquote, environment where there's an absence of civil unrest because the police are repressive and people know their place because they know they don't want to be pushed down by violence. But that's not a culture of peace. Next, please. So in this environment, Martin Luther King came in partnership with local leaders. And in 1963, on Good Friday before Easter, he met in the Gaston Motel with his key advisors, including Dr. Clarence B. Jones, who's with us this evening, who was Dr. King's lawyer and advisor. They just received an injunction from the court prohibiting them from marching against segregation. Dr. King took advice from his colleagues, and then he got on into his jeans and his protest clothes and went out to have a peaceful, nonviolent protest in violation of the injunction. And as a result, please, next slide, he was arrested for violating the injunction, and he was put in jail. Next slide, please. Now, when he was in jail, the only person who came in to see him was his lawyer, Dr. Jones, who you're going to meet briefly after my talk. And during that time, Dr. Jones was startled to see how agitated Dr. King was because he had read an advertisement in the local paper. Next, please. The advertisement was a one-page statement by white clergymen who rendered their judgment against Dr. King and told him to go home. And this upset Dr. King so much precisely because the people who wrote this were the most liberal anti-segregation clergy in Birmingham. What did they say? I'm going to read you a little bit of it, okay? They said, in Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have an opportunity for a new, constructive, and realistic approach to racial problems. So leave us alone because we can handle this. However, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens directed and led in part by outsiders. In other words, those outsiders and demonstrators are destroying our culture of peace. That was the claim they made. Next slide, please. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we're convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership, which is called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. Just leave us alone and we can have normal negotiation without the agitation that you're bringing to the streets. We have what Judge Weinstein said, a safe space for fair conflict resolution. So leave us alone. Next slide, please. Earlier, they pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religions and political traditions. But we also point out that such actions as to incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. In other words, the peaceful protest that Dr. King was leading would trigger the white supremacists to act with violence. So they're blaming the protesters for inciting violence. Next slide, please. And we further urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders, not in the streets. They thought they were being advocates of a peaceful culture and negotiations to lead to resolution in a culture of peace. Next slide, please. Dr. King was in this jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, and Dr. Jones can tell you he was very, very upset because he felt betrayed. These were the liberal clergy. So he scribbled on whatever paper he could find that he gave to Dr. Jones, who smuggled it out. And then for the next few days, Dr. Jones smuggled in the papers and he smuggled them out. And this became what's known as the very, very famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Next slide, please. In this letter, he writes, you deplore, and he's writing it directly to the clergy, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham. But your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations, the systemic violence of Jim Crow. You're complaining about the violence we're triggering by segregationists, but you say nothing about the underlying violence of Jim Crow. It's unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham. But it's even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative because there was no safe space to have negotiations. Next slide, please. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. First, collection of the facts. Make sure that you're doing the right thing, discernment, to determine whether injustice exists. Then efforts to negotiate. Then self-purification, meaning discipline about nonviolence. And last, direct action. We've gone through all these steps in Birmingham. Of course, there can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers. We tried, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. So you can't tell us to go and negotiate when they refuse to negotiate with us. What needed to happen was to change the distribution of power in Birmingham, Alabama, to make it possible for people to sit and negotiate in good faith and with a level playing field. Next slide, please. So this is where he says, you may well ask to these clergy, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Why do we have to go into the street? Isn't negotiation a better path? And this is what Dr. King says. you are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the doors to negotiation. So this is turning everything upside down. The call to, quote, be peaceful was in fact a call to accommodate repression and violence. And the path to a culture of peace required nonviolent direct action in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Can you go to the next slide and just show the first minute and 1/2 of this film? You'll hear the voice of Dr. Jones. Can you click on that link there?
Of all is a letter from the Birmingham jail. That is a symphony of social justice that you.
We can't see the film there. Okay, tell you what, why don't we skip this, and I'm going to send this link to Professor Gonzalez, and she'll send it out to everyone. I want you to watch this incredibly beautiful film that was made about what I just told you about with Dr. Jones. So I want to shift. Can you go to the next slide, please? So a few months later was the March on Washington. And Dr. King talked about the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. That comes from Gandhi. Satyagrahas, the force of love and the force of truth and the force of soul. And he said, next slide, please. He embraced and praised the marvelous new militancy of young people. Next slide, please. And he asked, there are those of you who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? And the first thing he said was, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. That was in 1963, August 28, and more than almost 60 years later, many of the things that he said we needed to achieve have been achieved. Jim Crow segregation, legal segregation was overthrown, which is a tremendous achievement, revolutionary achievement. But the unspeakable horrors of police brutality have not ceased, unfortunately. Next slide. And that's why we've been engulfed in our country and throughout the world in a massive protest to demand the end of brutality. And these protests, as our Judge Weinstein and others were saying, have been transformative, and they're just beginning. By far more people have protested in the last 3 weeks than came to the March on Washington, which was the largest protest in the history of the United States until that time. Millions of people. And this is a multiracial, multi-generational movement that's trying to address the legacy of slavery in the United States, finally, to bring racial justice to our country. And I think the philosophy of Dr. King is only through the process of nonviolent direct action can these issues be brought to the attention of our country so it's possible to negotiate. And the institute that Dr. Jones and I founded will be partnering with the Annenberg Foundation Trust to initiate a dialogue between racial justice advocates and police commissioners, police chiefs, and sheriffs to address police violence against communities of color in the United States, among many initiatives happening in our country. Next slide. So to conclude, I want to talk about Mexico. And I'm not an expert, and I do so mindful that I'm an American. I have not lived in Mexico, and I can't speak authentically for all the experiences that you have as Mexicans. We were planning to come on March 5th, which was a Friday, And it was canceled, as Nuria said, because of the coronavirus. Just a few days later, on Monday, March 8th, there was a massive protest in the streets of Mexico, organized by women, mostly women, to say we can no longer tolerate systemic violence against women and femicide as a pervasive structural system of violence in our country. And we will not pretend that through silence and acquiescence that this is a culture of peace, because it's not a culture of peace. And the next day, on March 9th, was the Dia Sin Nosotras, which was the strike organized by women for the same purpose and the same theory that Martin Luther King said, to create attention through dramatic, direct action, that issues of violence must be addressed. Next slide, please. In Mexico, as you know, there has been a tragic, pervasive problem of violence against women that's persistent. I think in the United States, we have a terrible problem of violence and guns, as you know, as well. I think it's a dramatic turn that in Mexico, there's been a realization and a coming to consciousness and reckoning for this pervasive problem. And that, next slide, please, that I do not want to die and I will not die, which is very similar to the signs you see in the United States about reminding, I can't breathe. There's been too much killing. Enough is enough. Enough is enough, because basic human rights have been violated. Next slide, please. So the march was, now one problem, there were, as I understand, some elements of that were to some extent violent. There were some reactions from the right wing, and there were some anarchists on the left wing. This is a problem that Martin Luther King had. Every peaceful protest has problems controlling people who are more extreme. The disciplined violence that nonviolence, the force of soul and the force of love requires being extremely rigorous and insisting we will only use nonviolence. We will reject all forms of violence, because that's the whole purpose of why we're here, to reject violence. Next slide, please. And I want to say to the women that what you're doing is extremely powerful. This is from The Guardian in England. I think the whole world is with you. And to the men, I say, please support the women in this struggle. It was postponed because of coronavirus. It will return. The whole world is with you. The struggle against police violence in the United States, the struggle against violence against women in Mexico, the struggle for social justice. These are international struggles for human rights that we have to wage together. And by fighting a nonviolent war, we bring about a culture of peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you. Thank you so much. Not justice, no peace. Certainly, justice and peace can only happen in a safe space. Thank you so much. Last but not least, I am honored to present Dr. Clarence B. Jones. You have heard this before, but I want to say it again anyway. Dr. Clarence Jones served as legal counsel, a strategic advisor, and draft speechwriter to Martin Luther King Jr. from 1960 to Dr. King's assassination in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. Dr. Jones was privy to Reverend King's decision-making processes and political struggles. Among other leading roles in his historic relationship with Dr. King, Dr. Jones met alone with Dr. King when he was incarcerated, as Jonathan said, when he was incarcerated in Birmingham, Alabama in April 1963, and helped him to smuggle out and publish the iconic letter from a Birmingham jail. He drafted the first 7 paragraph of Dr. King, I Have a Dream speech. Across the decades following Dr. King's assassination, Dr. Clarence Jones worked to carry on Dr. King's legacy to continue the non-violent struggle for social justice, voting rights, and democratic inclusion in a path-breaking career in law, business, finance, and communication, journalism, conflict resolution, teaching, writing, and policy advocacy. Please, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this discussion. Some of you are like, the dear friends here, like Nuria, and your husband and children, and Janet Martinez, you're like I call extended family.
Yeah,
thank you. That extends to Jonathan Greenberg, of course, also. So let me say, in the interest of time, that when you hear no justice, no peace, we are really saying to you, and the current movement is saying to you, because that comes from our movement, no justice, no peace, meaning you cannot have any peace where there is persistent injustice. And that we sought, I should say, Dr. King sought, he knew that the greatest obstacle and barrier we faced was people becoming adjusted and accommodated to the status quo. And the status quo often meant brutal forms of racial segregation. So that our objective is to awaken the conscience of the community, nationally, to awaken the conscience of America. He was smart enough, we knew, there's no way that in the 1960s, 12% of the population, African Americans, that we were going to be able to impose our will on 88% of the population, no matter how just and how valid our demands were. Simply was not going to happen. But the way we had to do that, we had to convince a majority of the 88% white folks, we had to convince them that it was in their self-interest that they join with us and end this racial segregation. We tried to explain to them that unless this is resolved, whether today, tomorrow, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, without the resolution, there is absolutely no way there can be an enduring peace. Society will simply not be able to function as a civil operating entity. To do that, society and those people who controlled the power in that society had to come to terms and to recognize that it's in its self-interest that we end this nonsense called racial segregation. It's in its self-interest to end the brutality. We're wasting a lot of resources, money, time, and that the best really the best of all possible worlds. Initially for Birmingham, for example, but then nationwide. So we had to end racial segregation. So here we have, again today, you have, I met Dr. King in the second week of February 1960, when I was 29 years old and he was 31. And I worked with him, as they now say, 24/7 from that second week in February until April 4th, 1968, 7.5 years, until the date of his assassination, April 4th, 1968. And that which remains constant has not changed. That which, just to be repetitive, remain constant, it's not changed. It's that no matter how you slice and dice it, no matter how you kind of reconstruct it and look at it, as a society, as a community in a society is going to, will be unable, simply unable to sustain any period of peace and durability concurrent with appalling injustice. It's an oxymoron. You can't have peace in a community without justice. It's in the self-interest of those who live in the civil society to come to terms and solve those problems which are keeping them apart. Now, we also understood, and this is, I've seen it in movements outside the United States, around the world, that one of the greatest threats to achieving justice by a movement which seeks to be committed to nonviolence is what we have a political term. It's called the agent provocateur. It's those persons who may initially be a part of your movement and will be as articulate and active as you are, but there will come a time where they will break ranks with you, or they will do something to provoke an act of violence against what you're seeking to do. Absolutely, deliberately, and intentionally do it, so that you're standing in line disciplined, and someone will take out from their vest, they'll take a brick when everybody is standing disciplined, and not, they'll take a brick and throw it and break a window. Or they'll take a brick or a piece of metal object and throw it against the head of police, because they have an agenda that is inconsistent with the agenda that we require. And it's not very complicated why nonviolence is so essential to success. Because we came to understand that the status quo, what they want us to do more than anything is to precipitate, to engage, to start violence, so that the violence which we initiate, or we're a third party initiated by an agent provocateur, the violence was obscure and prevent the content and the substance of the message that we're trying to get to the community. It'll be obscured. People won't pay attention to it. What they'll pay attention to is the violence. They won't, no matter how otherwise just your request is, or your demand, in quotes, demands are, they will not focus on the inherent justice of the demands. They will focus on the act of violence, because they will use the violence as an excuse for denying your nonviolent requests. And so we came to understand that our greatest challenge was a disciplined form of organization. Now, from an historical point of view, I want to be sure you hear it from me. Is that in the United States, the March on Washington, there were some 250,000, maybe maximum 275,000 people that convened on Wednesday, August 28, 1963. And then you've had, in the later 1960s, you had opposition to the Vietnam War. And you had opposition to the Vietnam War, in which you had, maybe much as 500,000, maybe 750,000 people all getting together at one time. But it's only this time, in 2020, that I have seen and witnessed something that I never thought I would live to see. And that is an outpouring of millions of people nationwide and even worldwide, the majority of whom are white. The majority of whom are white, and who, as a general rule, as a general characterization, they're in like what I would call the 18 to 34-year-old age group, but the great group of advertisers. That's the great people in the advertising business. That's the market they want, 18 to 34. I want to repeat what I said. You look carefully at those photos and television clips, and you see them in the United States, and you see them outside the United States. You see them in Germany, you see them in UK, you see them in Mexico, you see them in various places outside the United States. But in the United States, the most extraordinary thing is that an overwhelming majority of non-white people, or people who are not Black, are uniting around a banner that says Black Lives Matter. And that is a result of the cumulative effect, just one incident after another. The names are so, I don't want to take the time to name all of them, because by naming some, I will omit others that should be called, but just numerous African Americans been killed by the police use of lethal force. And with the technology of the cell phone and the video cam, people were able to see something quite extraordinary. In real time, they could see and watch 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a police officer's knee on the neck of George Floyd during a period of time in which he says, "I can't breathe." During which of time he cries out for his mother before his life is extinguished. after 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This went around the world. This was shocking. And so collectively, people began to ask, just what kind of country are we? Really, what kind of country are we? Is there some moral center? Is there something so common and so decency in the United States of America that says that there's some things which are just beyond the pale of decency and organized morality? That's what the George Floyd murder meant. And so for those of you whose professional skill set is conflict resolution, I don't mean to pour water on your parade of skill sets, because your discipline and the technique that you developed is very much needed. Because you cannot, while you know there can be no justice without peace, but as we're seeking to develop into a peaceful, beloved community, that will not be possible unless we're able to draw on the skill sets of people who are skilled in the art of mediation, who are skilled in how to bring people together and listen to their pain and help them work through their pain and come to a common resolution. Now, this skill set and discipline that you have, of course, very valuable in terms of commerce. That I know, but it's even more valuable now. And we have a mutual, like Grand Lum, who was chairman of the mediation board under the Civil Rights Bill that was passed in 1964. As we go forward in wrestling with this monster of the legacy of slavery and white supremacy that causes that substantial generations are infected by the virus of white supremacy. And that virus has insinuated itself and infected people with power, to the extent that those people with the power, white people with the political power, can come to see on a negotiated basis that it's in their self-interest that we all live with justice and in peace. So the skill sets you have collectively, I think, are going to be needed now and in the future more than ever. Going to be, and I repeat, will be needed now and more than ever. Because as the country deals with the new kinds of legislation and kinds of new techniques to deal with this, they're going to have to call on persons in my country, in the United States, like you. And I think that, Jonathan, I commend you for showing those slides about the women's movement in Mexico. I think that's very effective. The common denominator, and I'll just keep quiet, is not very complicated. There can be listen to me, there can be no durable peace with injustice. It's an oxymoron. The two are dialectically opposed, diametrically opposed. Cannot be. Simply, they cannot coexist in the same space. It's like you're going to have water and fire at the same time. No, you're going to have fire, you're going to have water. So I'm very honored that you permitted an old lawyer to come and talk to you. Many of you, I look and see your faces. Those of whom I do not know, and I know that I am looking at a generation that will carry forward the principles which you all collectively are disciplined on. I'm 89. I'll be, God willing, 90 in less than 6 months, and I'm going to haunt my enemies and live to 100. I mean, Jonathan doesn't want to hear that because he knows I'm going to be a pain in the ass if I live that long for him. No, he loves me dearly as a brother, as I know he does. And I don't want to get too personal here, but I'm very honored to see my sister, Jan, and my other sister, Nuria. That's a great thing. So thank you so much. Oh, no, I see down here. Oh my God, I see Nasuko Greenberg. Thank you. Oh my God, thank you. And I don't know, I see you, you know, you look so magnificent. My God. I'm going to have to learn to speak Spanish. I speak French, but not Spanish. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clarence. Judge Danny Weinstein is here with us. We can see him, but he is with us too. We cannot accommodate to the status quo, and no violence is essential to succeed. Definitely. I think that we all agree that to have these wonderful panelists is a privilege, especially in times of crisis and opportunity. Time is up, and unfortunately we have no time left for questions, but if you want to send those to me by mail, I will try to have them reply. We wish to thank you, or we wish to thank our participants, our attendees for making this event possible. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's amazing.
Thank you, Nuria.
You're welcome.
Nuria,
and for the record, Jonathan and I will come to Mexico when the pandemic subsides.
Please, promise?
Promise.
Nuria, one idea is, why don't make sure that you have the JAMS link and the Gould Center link and our Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice. I'll send everyone that little film so you can circulate those to everyone.
Thank you so much. I will do it. Thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity. You are amazing. You are extraordinary human beings. I love you, and everybody must love you too. Absolutely. Please have a good night. Stay safe and healthy.
Okay.